If you're reading this, welcome. You're about to spend one night in cabin 13. That's all you need to do. Stay in the cabin from sundown to sunrise. No distractions, no leaving early, no bending the rules. At 6 a.m., if you make it, the front door will unlock, and you're free to go. But if you don't follow the rules exactly as they are written, you'll never leave. Below are the rules you must follow. Read them carefully. Rules for surviving cabin 13. Rule 1. Enter the cabin by 7 p.m. sharp. The door will lock behind you the moment you cross the threshold. Do not attempt to open it again until 6 a.m. Rule 2. At 8 p.m. a lantern will light on its own. You must sit in its glow until 8:30 p.m. Do not leave the circle of light for any reason, no matter what you see or hear. You will not be alone. If the light flickers, do not look away. Keep your eyes locked on the lantern until it stabilizes. Rule 3. If you hear footsteps outside, close your eyes immediately. Do not open them until the footsteps pass. Warning: if the footsteps stop outside your door, cover your ears. Don't listen to what it says. No matter how familiar the voice sounds, it's not someone you know. Rule 4. At 9 p.m. you must check the bathroom mirror. If your reflection smiles at you, smile back. If it frowns, leave the bathroom and lock the door behind you. Do not open it for the rest of the night. Rule 5. Every hour, on the hour, a knock will sound on the walls, starting at 10 p.m. Count the knocks carefully. If there are 3 knocks, stay seated. If there are 5 knocks, you must turn off the lantern for exactly 10 seconds. Count carefully and turn it back on. If the knocks ever stop at 4, you are no longer alone in the cabin. Do not acknowledge them. Rule 6. Do not fall asleep. If you begin to feel drowsy, recite this phrase aloud. The night is long, but I will see the dawn. Do not stop until you feel awake again. Rule 7. If you hear a woman crying outside, do not open the door. She will say she is cold, lost, and begging for shelter. You are not safe if you let her in. She will stay forever. Rule 8. At 3:15 a.m. you will smell smoke. The fireplace will ignite on its own. Do not try to extinguish it. Sit quietly and wait until the flames die out. If the fire doesn't extinguish by 3:30 a.m., whisper, "I do not welcome you." Do not raise your voice. Wait in silence. Rule 9. If the clock strikes 4 a.m. and you hear whispering inside the walls, stay perfectly still. You might feel something brush against your arm or hear someone breathing behind you. Stay calm. Do not move. If they ask you a question, do not respond. Rule 10. At 5:55 a.m. you must stand by the front door and place your hand on the handle. You'll hear someone calling your name. It will sound exactly like someone you love. You must not answer. The door unlocks exactly at 6 a.m. Leave immediately. If it doesn't, you have failed, and you belong to the cabin now. Jonah Parker squinted at the worn piece of paper, his hands trembling as the sun dipped below the horizon. "This can't be real, right?" he muttered, glancing over at his girlfriend Emma, who was nervously pacing near the cabin's door. "We just need to follow the rules," Emma whispered, her voice tight with unease. "We get through one night, Jonah. One night, and we walk away with the money." Jonah forced a grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. They'd agreed to do this for the prize, $10,000 to anyone who could last through the night in cabin 13. A small fortune, and one they desperately needed. But now that cabin loomed over them, dark and silent. He wasn't so sure it was worth it. The windows were smeared with dirt, and the air felt thick and stagnant, as if the building was holding its breath, waiting for them to enter. Emma took his hand and squeezed it. "We'll be fine," she said, though her voice wavered. "We just have to follow the rules." Jonah swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. Together they stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening clunk, locking them in. 7 p.m., the first hour. The cabin was suffocatingly quiet, the only sound the creak of the old wood beneath their feet. They set their phones on the counter, no signal as they expected. Jonah lit the lantern they'd brought, though he knew it would extinguish soon. They sat on the dusty floor, waiting for 8 p.m. to arrive. At exactly 8 p.m., the cabin lantern flickered to life, casting a dim, flickering glow across the room. The shadows seemed too long, stretching unnaturally across the walls. Jonah shivered. "Stay in the light," Emma whispered, her knees drawn to her chest. For 30 minutes they sat without speaking. When the lantern flickered violently, Jonah's heart stopped. His instinct screamed at him to look away, but the rules had been clear. Don't look away. He locked his gaze on the lantern, his breath shallow. After what felt like an eternity, the flickering stopped. At 9:12 p.m., footsteps crunched outside the cabin, slow and deliberate. Jonah's stomach churned as the heavy steps drew closer to the door. Emma squeezed her eyes shut. Jonah followed suit, his heart hammering in his chest. The footsteps stopped, right outside the door. "Jonah," a familiar voice whispered. His heart nearly stopped. It was his brother, Owen. Impossible. Owen had been dead for 2 years. Emma whimpered beside him, her nails digging into his arm. Jonah fought every instinct to respond. It isn't real, he told himself, biting down on his lip until he tasted blood. Eventually, the voice faded and the footsteps moved on. When 9 p.m. arrived, Jonah and Emma hesitantly approached the bathroom. Jonah leaned toward the mirror, his heart pounding. His reflection stared back at him, but then, slowly it smiled. Jonah's stomach churned. He forced himself to smile back. The reflection's grin stretched impossibly wide before it returned to normal, and Jonah stumbled backward, gasping for air. "That wasn't me," he whispered. The knocks came, right on schedule. 3. They stayed still. 5. Jonah turned off the lantern for exactly 10 seconds, counting carefully. But at 2 a.m., 4 knocks echoed through the cabin. Emma began to sob. They weren't alone anymore. The night dragged on, each rule more terrifying than the last. When the clock struck 4 a.m., whispers filled the room. Jonah felt something cold brush against his neck, but he remained perfectly still. Emma sat beside him, trembling. "Don't move," she mouthed. At 5:55 a.m., they stood by the door, hands gripping the handle. "Emma," a voice whispered from outside. It was Jonah's mother. "Sweetheart, please, I need you. Open the door." Tears streamed down Emma's face, but she didn't move. The voice grew more desperate, more insistent, until it was practically screaming. At exactly 6 a.m., the lock clicked. Jonah yanked the door open, dragging Emma into the cold morning air. Jonah and Emma stumbled into the daylight, gasping for air as the cold morning breeze hit their faces. The front door of cabin 13 swung shut behind them with a quiet final click, as though the nightmare had never happened. They stood in silence on the gravel path, stunned by the fact that they were still alive. Jonah could feel his heart hammering painfully in his chest. They'd done it. They had followed every rule. Somehow, against all odds, they had survived the night. Emma gave a shaky laugh, clutching Jonah's arm. "We made it," she whispered, as if saying it out loud would tempt fate to reverse their escape. Jonah squeezed her hand, too exhausted to speak, but relief washed over him like a wave. Their phones buzzed simultaneously. Jonah fumbled to pull his out of his jacket pocket. His fingers were stiff from fear, and the glowing screen felt strange and alien in his hand after the surreal nightmare of the cabin. Transaction complete. $10,000 has been deposited into your account. Jonah let out a breathless laugh, showing Emma the message. "Guess we actually won," she whispered, though her voice held no joy. The victory felt hollow after what they had gone through. But there was one more message. Jonah's brow furrowed as the next notification came through. A second message from the contest organizers. "Congratulations. As part of your reward, you've also won a complimentary trip aboard the midnight train for a once-in-a-lifetime experience." Attached was a pair of digital train tickets. "What the hell is the midnight train?" Emma muttered, scrolling through the email. Jonah's stomach churned. The phrase sent a cold pulse down his spine, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was the phrasing, "once in a lifetime." It reminded him too much of the cabin's eerie, finality-tinged rules. Emma tapped the ticket on her phone. "Look, it leaves tonight, from the old station downtown." Jonah blinked at her, confused. The station downtown's been closed for years. Emma shrugged, though her expression mirrored Jonah's unease. Maybe it's some kind of underground tour, or maybe the company just uses it to freak people out. It's probably just more of their weird horror gimmick. Jonah stared at the screen, the sleek black digital ticket glowing faintly. Departure, midnight, Platform 3. It seemed too convenient, too sudden, but before Jonah could protest, Emma grabbed his arm. "It's part of the deal, right? We've already been through hell. It can't be worse than the cabin." Jonah wanted to argue. His gut told him that stepping onto this train would be a mistake, an irreversible one. But after everything they'd survived, the idea of saying no to a prize felt wrong. They'd earned this. Besides, Emma was already texting him the ticket. "Come on," she said with a tired smile. "One more adventure, and after this we're done." Jonah forced himself to nod. One more adventure, he thought. What could go wrong? They arrived at the station just before midnight. The building was dark and empty, crumbling with age and neglect. The platform was slick with rain, and a thick mist hung in the air, shrouding everything beyond a few feet. Jonah and Emma walked side by side, their footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. "This place gives me the creeps," Emma muttered, shivering. Jonah didn't respond. His eyes kept flicking to the shadows around them, where strange shapes seemed to shift and ripple beneath the mist. Something in the air felt wrong, heavy, like they were standing on the edge of a precipice they couldn't see. And then, just as the clock on Emma's phone turned to 12 a.m., the train appeared. It emerged from the mist without warning, a hulking, rusted beast of metal and shadows. The midnight train clattered into the station with a deafening screech, its windows glowing faintly with a sickly yellow light. The door slid open with a low mechanical hiss. No conductor greeted them. No passengers disembarked. The train simply waited, dark and silent, its open doors inviting them inside. Jonah's throat went dry. "Emma," he whispered, grabbing her hand. "I don't think we should." Emma shook her head, her grip tightening around his. "We've come this far. Let's just get it over with." Before Jonah could protest, Emma stepped onto the train, and Jonah, despite every instinct screaming at him to run, followed. The door slammed shut behind them the moment they stepped inside, sealing them in with a heavy clang. The interior of the train was just as unsettling as its exterior, old with cracked leather seats and flickering lights that buzzed faintly. The air smiled of dust and something metallic, like rust or blood. There were other passengers scattered throughout the carriage, but none of them spoke or even moved. They sat hunched in their seats, staring straight ahead, faces pale and gaunt. A chill crawled down Jonah's spine as he and Emma found a pair of seats near the back. As soon as they sat down, a folded card appeared on the armrest between them. Jonah picked it up, hands shaking, and opened it. Rules for the midnight train. Rule 1. Do not leave your seat until 12:30 a.m. The train does not stop until dawn. There is no reason to move before then. Rule 2. If you hear voices behind you after midnight, do not respond. They will try to lure you. Keep your eyes forward no matter what they say. Rule 3. Do not look out the windows between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. The reflections are not your own. If they see you looking, they will come inside. Rule 4. At 2:45 a.m., someone will board from the wrong side. Do not speak to them. If they sit beside you, do not look directly at them. Rule 5. Before the train stops, write your name on the back of this card. If the ink fades before the conductor collects the card, you are no longer yourself. Emma leaned closer, her breath warm on Jonah's ear. "Looks like we've got more rules to follow," she whispered. Jonah clenched his jaw, the memory of Cabin 13 flashing through his mind. "I don't like this," he muttered. "It feels too familiar." Emma squeezed his hand, offering a small, reassuring smile. "We've done this before, right? We just follow the rules and we'll be fine." But Jonah wasn't sure. This time the rules felt different, as though the stakes were higher. The train jolted forward. They were on their way. The train rattled through the night, the carriage swaying gently with the motion. Jonah and Emma sat in silence, staring at the rules card as if it was their lifeline. At exactly 12 a.m., the first voice came. "Emma." A soft, broken whisper drifted from the seat behind them. Jonah's stomach twisted painfully. Emma went rigid, her hand tightening around Jonah's. The voice came again, fragile and desperate. "Emma, please, it's me. I need you." Jonah's pulse thundered in his ears, Don't respond. Don't turn around. The rules were clear. Emma's breath hitched, her fingers twitching against Jonah's palm. He could feel the urge rising in her, the same urge he'd felt at the cabin when something whispered his name from behind the door. "It's not real," Jonah whispered through clenched teeth. "Don't answer it." Emma closed her eyes, her body trembling with the effort to resist. The voice behind them grew more insistent, more familiar. "Emma, please, don't leave me." Tears streamed down Emma's face, but she kept her mouth shut, her hands gripping Jonah's like a lifeline. The voice faded into the shadows, leaving behind only the sound of the train clattering on the tracks. The clock on Jonah's watch ticked over to 1 a.m., and the windows of the train filled with darkness. "Don't look," Jonah whispered, gripping Emma's arm. But curiosity was a dangerous thing. In the window's reflection, something moved, just a flicker at first, then a shape, grinning with teeth too sharp and a gaze too cold. It watched them hungrily, waiting for one of them to meet its eyes. Emma clenched her fists, knuckles white. "We're not falling for this again," she whispered. Jonah nodded, heart pounding as the figure in the reflection pressed its face closer to the glass, tapping slowly. They didn't look. When the clock struck 2:45 a.m., the door hissed open and a passenger boarded from the wrong side. He sat beside Jonah. His skin was pale and stretched too tight over his face, his eyes dark pits. Jonah kept his gaze forward, refusing to acknowledge the thing breathing heavily beside him. At 5:55 a.m., Jonah and Emma prepared to leave. They wrote their names on the back of the card, praying the ink would stay. And when the train screeched to a halt at 6 a.m., they bolted for the doors as if their lives depended on it. Because they did. They stumbled off the train and into the cold morning light, gasping for air once again. But something had followed them off the train, and the rules weren't over yet. Jonah and Emma stumbled off the midnight train, gasping for air. They clutched each other, shaking as the train hissed and vanished into the mist behind them. The cold morning air pressed against their skin, but relief was fleeting, because someone had followed them off the train. At first, it was just a glimpse, a shadow of movement at the edge of their vision. Jonah turned his head quickly, but there was nothing there. He thought it might be a trick of the mind, just residual fear from the nightmare ride, until he saw the man, a tall, thin figure in a black suit, his face pale and expressionless. He stood at the platform's edge, staring at them, staring directly into Jonah's eyes. "Do you see him?" Jonah whispered, his voice trembling. Emma turned slowly. "What the hell?" she muttered. The man took a step forward, then another, and another. He moved with impossible grace, gliding toward them like a shadow untethered from the ground. Without warning, he was gone. Jonah blinked, and in the instant it took to exhale, the man reappeared beside them, inches away. Before either of them could react, the man shoved them in opposite directions. Emma screamed as she fell backwards into the swirling mist. Jonah reached for her, but the world tilted and he felt himself falling into somewhere far worse. Jonah hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. When he opened his eyes, he found himself lying on the cold, tiled floor of what looked like a psychiatric hospital. The air was stale, reeking of antiseptic and damp walls. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, flickering in and out. The hallway was long and empty, lined with locked doors. A clipboard lay at his feet with a list of rules scrawled in jagged handwriting. Rules for the hospital. Rule 1. When you enter a room, close the door behind you immediately. If the door swings open on its own, leave the room immediately. Someone else wants that space. Rule 2. If you see a nurse with her back turned to you, do not call out to her. Walk past her as quietly as possible. If she turns around, run to the nearest exit. Rule 3. If a patient offers you something, no matter what it is, refuse politely and leave. Taking anything from the patients binds you to them. You don't want to know what they'll ask for in return. Rule 4. The clocks on the walls lie. Do not rely on them to tell the time. At 2 a.m., all clocks will stop for 1 minute. Do not move during this time. Rule 5. You must find a key hidden somewhere in the hospital to escape. If you don't find it by sunrise, you will never leave. Jonah's pulse quickened as he read the list. His mouth went dry. Just follow the rules, he told himself. You've done this before. The hallway stretched ahead of him, endless and suffocating. Somewhere in the distance, he heard a soft the sound of someone's shoes tapping against the tile floor. He took a deep breath and started walking. Jonah passed by a series of patient rooms, the doors tightly shut. As he turned a corner, a door creaked open on its own. A chill ran down his spine. The first rule. Without hesitation, he backed away from the room. As he did, he saw a woman in a nurse's uniform standing at the far end of the hallway, her back to him. Her long black hair dripped water onto the floor. Jonah's heart raced. Don't call out, don't make a sound. He turned slowly, moving past her as quietly as he could. But as he slipped by, the nurse whispered softly, "Jonah." He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The air grew heavy and the lights flickered violently. He knew if she turned around, there was no escape. With every ounce of willpower, Jonah forced himself forward, refusing to look back, but the whisper followed him down the hall. Emma stumbled backward, landing hard on the soft, wet earth. She looked up and found herself in the middle of a cemetery, rows upon rows of crumbling headstones stretched into the mist. A folded piece of paper fluttered down beside her, carried by an unseen breeze. Her hands trembled as she picked it up and read the rules. Rules for the cemetery. Rule 1. Do not read any names aloud from the gravestones. Saying a name invites them to rise. They do not rest peacefully. Rule 2. If you see a figure standing near a grave, do not approach them. They are waiting for someone, and it's not you. Rule 3. At midnight, the gates will open for 5 minutes. You must leave by then, or you'll never leave at all. If the gates close, find the caretaker, but beware, he asks for favors. Rule 4. If someone whispers your name from beneath the ground, do not respond. It knows you. It wants to trade places. Emma's heart pounded as she folded the paper, shoving it into her pocket. The air smelled of damp earth and rot, and the fog thickened with every step she took. Somewhere in the distance, a gate creaked open. Emma glanced around nervously. The cemetery was still, too still. Shadows flickered between the gravestones. From the corner of her eye, she saw a figure in black standing by a grave. She bit her lip, fighting the urge to look closer. Don't approach them, she reminded herself. It's not for you. As Emma wandered through the rows of gravestones, she heard the faintest whisper, a familiar voice, one she hadn't heard in years. Emma. She stopped cold. The whisper came again from beneath the ground. It's me. Please help me. Emma clenched her fists. No, it's a trick. But the voice sounded so much like her father. Gone for 10 years now, lost to cancer. Tears welled in her eyes as she backed away from the grave, her heart splitting between grief and fear. The whisper followed her. Don't leave me here, Emma. Jonah ran through the endless hospital halls, the sound of footsteps chasing him. The lights above flickered wildly, and doors slammed shut all around him. Panic clawed at his mind. He had to find the key. He had to escape. Finally, he saw it. A door at the end of the hallway cracked open just slightly. He sprinted toward it, ignoring the growing whispers that begged him to turn around. He shoved the door open and found himself standing in the middle of the cemetery. Emma gasped as Jonah stumbled out of the door, drenched in sweat and panic. "Jonah?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Before either of them could speak, the ground beneath them began to shift. The fog thickened, swirling violently as the air filled with the sound of whispers. Whispers of names and promises, lies and regrets. Jonah grabbed Emma's hands. "We have to go now." Together they sprinted through the mist, dodging shadowy figures that reached for them from the graves. The gates loomed ahead, creaking open as if beckoning them through. But just as they reached the threshold, the man in the black suit appeared again, blocking their path. He smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that chilled them to the bone. Jonah didn't think. He lunged forward, shoving the man aside with all his strength. The man stumbled, his grin faltering just long enough for Jonah and Emma to dive through the gates. The gates slammed shut behind them with a deafening clang. They collapsed on the other side, gasping for breath once again. The fog began to lift, the cemetery and the hospital dissolving into nothingness behind them. They lay side by side, clutching each other's hands as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. They had escaped. Again. But Jonah knew deep in his heart that it wasn't over. Not yet, because the rules always came back, and the man in the black suit was still out there, waiting for them to slip up, waiting for them to break the rules.